Hello, welcome. This is another F583 A2 OCR economics video. Now, in this video, we're going to be looking at something called the Gini and Lorenz curve. Sorry, the Gini coefficient and the Lorenz curve. Sorry, and then I'm going to be looking at the different types of poverty in terms of absolute poverty, relative poverty, which are two different things, obviously. And then I'm going to be looking at a bit more into poverty in terms of, you know, what causes it, what's bad about it, and how can we solve it. So quite an in-depth kind of video. And then the video after this in the series I'm hoping to upload them is going to be migration, which is we're going to be looking at, so this is in the next video really, you know, is it good to have an influx of migration without being too stereotypical? Okay, so the first thing, as I said, we're going to look at is something called the Gini coefficient and the Lorenz curve. Now, to understand the Gini coefficient, we have to be able to first understand something called the Lorenz curve. Now, on two of the axes, on a standard set of axes. Okay. Alright, so on the x-axis, we've got, it's not really an increase in terms of the sheer, you know, 0 to 100. It's looking at in terms of the, I'll draw it on. So up to this point we've got the lowest 20%, or the poorest 20%, and then, so we're looking at wealth really on the bottom, the spread of wealth, and then the middle 20%. So it's the, yeah, so it's the lowest 20% in society, the wealth of the middle 20% in society, and then finally, just like follow the pattern, we've got the top 20% in society. In terms of, this is terms of wealth really. Okay, and then we've got cumulative income on the top in percentages. Is it percentages? Sorry, tick. Percentage of cumulative. I can never say this. Cumulative income. So it's all that income added together as a percentage. So the richest 20%, their total income compared to, you know, the total income of the middle 20%, etc. Alright, cumulative income. Sorry, I was expecting that to be a bit neater. Now, this is the first thing I'm going to draw on there is it's almost, you can think of it almost like the when we look at the business cycle, we talk about the trend GDP. Now obviously we're not talking about GDP, we're not doing the business cycle, but basically what I'm trying to get across to you is this ideal spread of wealth, because obviously what this graph is going to show us is the spread of wealth and income over the three categories we've got here. Now obviously the lowest 20% is obviously going to have the lowest cumulative income, and then it should increase, but really what this graph should show us is the rate at which that is spread. Now, I think of that trickle-down effect we talked about in the last video, where, you know, everyone should have the same amount of increase in income, you know, when GDP increases. I know we're talking about really F585 there, or F582, I mean F583, so you're, what the hell are you going on about? Well, good question actually. But I was just trying to get across that it should be linear, because if it's spread evenly, the wealth, then it should be completely linear. So we need to draw on this sort of ideal line here, which will go something linear, something like that. And as I said, when you actually draw this in the exam, you can write ideal next to it. So that's the ideal spread of income. Okay, but in society, we know that's really not what happens. Which actually leads me on to a good Green Day song, which talks about 99 revolutions, which, you know, poorest, I think I mentioned that in that last video, you know, the richest 1% of the wealth of the poorest 99%. So anyway, what I'm trying to say is it's not linear like that. Okay, and the actual curve goes something like that. I mean, mine probably is a little bit too curvy up here, and it should be more sort of parabolic, but I've not drawn that brilliantly. But you get the idea from that. It's not linear, it's sort of this curve that we've got going on here. Now, what we need to be able to do. Now that's the Lorenz curve, okay, but what does that, to be able to understand what this is really showing us in terms of, I don't know, let's one second, let me redraw that curve, and you'll see why I want to redraw it in a minute. Okay, something like that. If I draw a line down, dotted line down from where the ideal curve meets this, the current, really, think of it like that. That's what the distribution of income is more likely to be rather than the ideal one. Okay. Now we need to look at these. So I've drawn a dotted line up, down from where these two curves intersect. Obviously, it's not going to get increased, but you just get that at some point they're going to be level the same. Okay. Right. So we need to compare this area here. I'm going to call this section A and section B. What the Gini coefficient does is compare the size of this area with the size of the whole area. So the area. So well, it's a ratio really. It's the ratio of area A or section A in comparison to the areas of section A and section B put together. So what does that really show? So that leads us to this equation for the Gini coefficient. So the Gini coefficient measures wealth. Okay, so instead it's the area of section A in comparison to the area of section A and section B. So it's a ratio, so therefore it's coefficient. So therefore it's section A over section A plus B. Okay. Alright. So what's the point in this? Well, we need to go back to the idea of what these curves actually are. Now the ideal curve, that's the curve that we want a distribution of income to actually be, and this other sort of parabolic one is the actual distribution, it's something that's more representative of what the actual distribution of wealth is in society. So therefore the gap between them is sort of going to be, think of it, the distance between the distribution of income that we want and the distribution of income that we currently have. That's just by rearranging the wording of what the two lines are actually showing us. So therefore, we can say that's a spread of wealth, really. So therefore, that allows us to come up with this equation which shows us the overall spread of wealth. Because we could compare it at one given point, from that point to the curve, and then from that point to the x-axis of the graph. But this kind of shows us across all of the 20%, to the lowest 20%, middle 20%, top 20%. Okay? Hopefully that made some kind of sense. Yeah. Oh, by the way, this coefficient. So, what does it actually mean? You won't be asked to work out the area. That's more of a maths thing. But they may state the area of section A, state the area of section B, and ask you to work out the Gini coefficient. Now, at any given point, it will always be less than or equal to 1 of Gini coefficient. If it is 1, that would simply mean that all of the country's wealth is enjoyed by one person. So it's very unlikely that you will ever get that, as you can tell. Okay, so that's the Gini coefficient and the Lorenz curve. Sorry I kept looking down, just wanted to keep making sure that I'm not going on to something I shouldn't be. Okay, so we're going to go on to something which kind of relates to this, because obviously distribution of wealth and income is kind of related to poverty. Because the poorest 20% are going to have the lowest, the spread of income is the lowest. So, therefore we need to look at poverty because of this. Now, the two types of poverty that I want to come across today. Okay, so the two types of poverty are called absolute poverty and relative poverty. Now, although they sound the same, they mean completely different things. Absolute poverty, now whenever you see absolute, it's a definitive meaning, it's generally what's stereotyped to be poverty. Someone in poverty is essentially, in absolute poverty, is unable to pay for like shelter, food, warmth, clothes, that kind of thing. So absolute poverty is really what most people associate with as being poverty. Okay, so I'll just write it on the board here. So absolute poverty. So where you can't compare it to anything else, and you can't say, no way you can say this is not poverty, it's absolute poverty. So unable to acquire or buy essentials. I'm not talking about hair straighteners and stuff. You talk about food, water, that kind of thing. Okay, right. Okay, so obviously I mentioned another type of poverty before, and some of you may be going, okay, well, you've discussed poverty. What other you could say and relate the word poverty to it that isn't absolute poverty? Well, good question. If you ask that, essentially what it is this thing called relative poverty. And as you can guess from the title, kind of, you know, like in Blue Peter, as you see what I made earlier. I don't know how that relates to it, but whatever. Relative poverty. Okay, so you can probably guess from the title, relative poverty is relative to something. But obviously the key question here is, what is it relative to? Now, when we talk about these two things, we talk about individuals. So it's something that is relative to an individual's level of poverty. So okay, let's look at that a bit further. So all I'm doing is breaking down these two words to try and build up an understanding of what it actually means. Okay, so we said it's relative, and it's the relative poverty of an individual to another individual. We couldn't really build that extra step in there. So, what we've learned so far is relative poverty is someone's poverty relative to someone else. Don't write all this down, by the way, I'm just trying to build up to the end answer and I will specify it. Okay, so if we're looking at one person's poverty in relation to someone else's, obviously not everyone's, you know, in poverty, but we're looking at specific areas within the country, that kind of thing. So country, society, whatever. We're looking at, you know, individual areas where someone might live, neighbourhoods, etc., etc. Now, if your whole neighbourhood is in poverty, then the relative poverty will be very small, because your poverty, in contrast to other people's poverty where you live, is not going to be that different. You're going to be pretty much all the same if you're all in absolute poverty. You know, that kind of thing. So what we're trying to say essentially is that relative poverty is where you are poorer than everyone else who lives around you. But if you all have the same distribution of wealth, income, that kind of thing, in terms of, you know, you can't pay for certain things as a collective group, then you are considered to be in low relative poverty, even though you might be in absolute poverty. So that's the key thing, really. You can be in absolute poverty, but you're not necessarily in relative poverty if everyone else is in the same situation as you where you live. Okay, so really, relative poverty is to do with comparing poverty levels. Essentially to where you live. Okay. I don't want to write any more than that because I think I've said it quite a few times, and you probably had enough of me discussing it, talking about it. Okay. Okay. So that's absolute poverty and relative poverty. So what we've done so far is we've done the Lorenz curve and the Gini coefficient, which we said is comparing the distribution of income, and absolute and relative poverty. Okay, so we're going to look at this idea of poverty in a little bit more detail. Sorry, I kept bowing my head throughout this video. I do apologise. Okay, so we're going to, as I said, we're going to go on to poverty now. So the ways that so the first thing I want to discuss is measuring relative poverty. Now this is really a very small part of this video because we've already done it. Obviously, poverty, the distribution of wealth and income. So we can look at the Gini coefficient, the Lorenz curve, and obviously these two other models of absolute and relative poverty. So they're all ways of measuring relative poverty. Okay? The first one I'm going to look at now in terms of, because I talked about, we're going to look at the causes of it, we're going to look at you know, the consequences, how right, bad, etc. The first one I'm going to look at is the problems that poverty causes. Now, obviously these may be really easy to think of, but it's nice to just recap them all. Okay, so problems of poverty. Now, the main one that obviously we'll think of is we define it as low living standards, or low standard of living. So you know, it's not very enjoyable to be in poverty. Low standard of living. Okay. Another one could be, obviously it goes off of this really, malnutrition, because if you're living a low standard of life, then you're generally not going to be fed as well. So malnutrition, which obviously leads to lower lifespan. Now all these are three separate problems of poverty, but I'm linking them all. So lower lifespan. Okay. So as I said, they're generally the ones that will come to mind when you think of poverty. The other one I can kind of link from this is alienation from society, because you don't generally think, oh, I'm going to go out with a homeless person. That kind of stigma of, oh, I don't want to go near them, walking past them on the street, trying to walk around them. So alienation from society. Now I'm not saying everyone does that, but the vast majority of people probably do. So alienation from society. Excuse my spelling. Okay. Right. So now we've looked at it in from the case of the individual. We need to look at problems of poverty, not necessarily from the case or the perspective of the individual. Maybe we need to look at it in terms of the other people who are associated. Not necessarily. You almost think of this as, you know, the external costs of poverty. Check us F581 knowledge out here. It's coming thick and fast, don't worry. Okay, so why am I going on about external costs rather? I just lost it completely and forgot what I'm doing. Well, I've not just yet, so you know, don't worry about that. Not that you were worrying at all. Anyway, shut up. But anyway, okay. So going on external costs. So costs of poverty that don't affect the individual who is in poverty. Now, assuming this is absolute poverty, by the way. Right. So the main person who has to pay or suffer some kind of cost from poverty is the government, because they have to, well, taxpayer really. So it's kind of a burden on the, you know, because the government has to, you know, pay for, you know, if they're in poverty, they're more likely to cause commit acts of crime. You know, because obviously they don't have the money to buy it, but they need to buy it to live. So some take drastic measures of resulting to crime, turning to crime. Sorry. So kind of burden on the government / taxpayer. Now some homeless, not homeless, well, technically, yeah, people in poverty, absolute poverty, they kind of commit these crimes, not necessarily just to get the goods or whatever they're trying to get. It's also the incentive of having somewhere nice to sleep in, kind of, you know, well, it's not so nice, but a police station where there's warmth, that kind of thing. So burden on the government really, which has to be paid for. So it'd be better for the government, they'd be paying out less fees on policing, you know, that kind of thing. So burden on the government in terms of costs. Okay, so they're problems of poverty. Now we need to look at the causes. What actually causes someone to be in poverty? Now, as I said, we're assuming this is absolute poverty. Well, there's quite a lot that could cause someone to be in poverty. Now I'm just going to go through the way that I've listed them on my sheet. Now, you know, the first ones may not necessarily be so obvious. I'm sure you could think of a few straight away, but don't worry, I will talk through them as I always do. So the first one is a lack of information. Like, how does a lack of information enable someone to be in poverty? Well, a lack of information just is where an individual doesn't know, you know, just all about something. Now, obviously, they don't know all about poverty, and they don't choose to be in poverty, obviously. But we're talking about educational and training opportunities, and therefore jobs. They may not have heard of a certain job before, you know, they say they get fired from one job. They were given a couple of weeks' notice. if they didn't have perfect information or good information to be able to look at other jobs, at possibilities before, you know, they were made to be in absolute poverty because they couldn't pay for the basic necessities in life. And if they didn't know about a job over the road, then they wouldn't be able to apply for that job over the road. They wouldn't be able to replace that old source of income with a new source of income. So obviously that leads us to believe that this could cause them to be in poverty. So obviously this leads to an increase in unemployment and a decrease in income. So therefore, obviously they become closer to being in absolute poverty or end up in absolute poverty. The next one is more of an obvious one. It's kind of the wage rate. Okay, so obviously wage rate is how much someone's paid per hour, and obviously if they're not being paid enough and their rent's far higher, or their mortgage repayments is far higher than their rent, then obviously they end up, you know, they can't afford to pay for the house, they can't afford to pay for the basic necessities, food, shelter, I kind of say same kind of thing, food, shelter, warmth, clothes, etc. Then obviously they become in absolute poverty. But you know, obviously they could combat that wage fall or move to a different firm with a higher wage rate. But you get the idea of wage rate can one of the main causes, and generally probably one of the first things that you thought of when you thought of a cause of poverty. So without being paid enough, so you can't pay someone else. Okay, so the next one, we call it a family unit. Okay, and this one is a bit more obscure in terms of it doesn't quite tell you, it doesn't tell you exactly what's on the tin, kind of thing. Now, really, when we talk about family units, we're not talking about, you know, a family of 4 or 5 where you got mum and dad in work and, you know, the kids hopefully, you know, some kind of education if they're the right age. We're talking about, you know, the typical stories of the lone parent and the kid, and the young kid. Obviously, the parent can't. It's going to be quite difficult for the parent to get a full-time job. You know, unless they start palming the kid off on their relatives for many years to come, until the child can look after itself, kind of thing. Obviously, you know, you don't get a 6-year-old in a house and fight for yourself. So I'm off to a full-time job. But you know, it's very hard for someone to commit to a lone parent to commit to a full-time job. Obviously, therefore they're quite limited in what they can apply for. So therefore, we can say obviously. They're probably, it can relate it to the wage rate thing. Maybe they're not going to get a job which is entirely the wage is going to be so high, but generally what we're relating it to here is they're not going to get a job which, obviously the more hours you work, the more income you get, and obviously they've restricted the hours they can work, therefore the income's going to be reduced, therefore they're close to being in poverty, absolute poverty. Okay, the next one is age. Okay. So there's 2 different aspects we can look at this from. Now, generally, when we say age and related to some kind of poverty, 2 images come to mind straight away, and should be the correct images. So you've got kind of the older generation who are out of work, who can't commit themselves to the labour market, so therefore they can't apply for any kind of job, so therefore they can't apply for any kind of income. And if they're just solely relying on the state pension, which is something we'll come on to a way of getting out of it in a minute, but if they're solely relying on the state pension, it's very limited in what they get, because the government's trying to reduce it. Because obviously, for people like me, when I come to apply for my pension, I'm sure you know, there won't be anything left in the piggy bank, so to speak. And that's what really reminds me about watching, you know, the Channel 5 programmes where they're trying to con themselves into an extra 500 quid a week. You just want to go and slap these people on the side of the face, go, oi, you know, you've done bad. I was trying to think of a good punch-up line then, but couldn't think of one. Anyway, so age. So we said that affects. So, well, this is causes. Sorry. So causes. Okay, so age. We said 2 age of spectrum. So we're looking at the older generation who can't commit themselves to the labour market, so therefore they can't receive their level of income to support themselves. Alright, so that's one way, one side of looking at the kind of the age thing. However, we can also look at the other end of the spectrum for age. Now, this is one that's generally not thought about, because it is, you know, the younger generation are obviously full-time education, so they're more likely to be in poverty because they don't have a job, provide an income to pay for stuff, what they have to go out and study, etc. Well, not go out, so they have to study. So, you know, they're less likely to be able to receive some kind of job, some kind of income. Now, we normally associate these kind of people living in nice family units. No, well, because that's wrong, great. I'm saying it, nice families where the mum and dad will pay for them. But, you know, some situations may occur that, you know, they're on their own and they're studying, and obviously they don't have an income to pay. But as I said, generally it's more the older side of this spectrum, the age thing that we look at rather than the younger ones. But you have to be aware that it's still a possibility for someone young to be in poverty, and that gap is kind of increasing with student debt recently. Okay, so that's becoming more of an issue than it previously was. Right, this other one, you may wonder why this is. Okay, so tax. Alright, so why are we discussing tax when we discuss when we're discussing poverty? Well, obviously, the reason I'm looking at this is because there's a couple of complications in terms of alternative ways of looking at this that we're going to go into when we look at ways of reducing it. Okay, right, I'll do now. Okay, so the tax. Well, we have these things in one of the ways that the government, one of the main sources of funding for the government is something called income tax, which you'll be heavily aware of if you earn over, I think it's about £12,000 or £10,000 a year. It might even be 7 now. Over a certain amount, and you'll be entered into a tax bracket, and the more you earn, the higher the tax bracket. If we employ a system of a progressive tax, which is again one of the ways we're going to look on that combats poverty. Okay, so if you're moved into a higher tax bracket, if your pay's not being increased by a certain amount, but you've been moved into a high tax bracket, which has increased your income. If the the income tax that you pay, if the increase in income tax is bigger than your increase in income, then obviously your, well, I don't want to say real wage, the actual income that you receive is actually going to be lower. So that's one way of looking at the tax. So obviously, if your actual income is lower, you're closer to being in absolute poverty, etc. Alright, the next one is health. Now, we're not talking about taking a sick day off work and that causing you to be in poverty, although that definitely doesn't help. Okay, so health, what we're talking about here is the more long-term illnesses, so in terms of, you know, maybe disabilities, or long-term sickness, something that prevents someone from working. So obviously, all this is related around the income that someone receives. So if they're on a very low income because they are long-term sick or disabled, then obviously they cannot work, or they're very, very limited into what they can do. Which overall, I mean, even if they could get a job, they won't be paid very much because they're not going to be considered to be that productive. And obviously that represents a cost for the business, etc, etc. But what we're really looking at here is the fact that if they're long-term sick or disabled, they will have a lower income, hence be closer to being in poverty. Okay, so that's health. The next one is something we call regional policy. Okay, well, what does this mean? Well, generally when you hear regional policies from the government, it is something to do with lower tax rate in certain areas for businesses. But remember, we're looking at poverty. That is kind of related to it. But in some areas they may be deprived. The businesses won't want to set up there. So obviously that creates a high level of unemployment. So therefore, if there's a high level of unemployment, there's generally a low income in these areas. This is generally areas where the businesses don't want to set up because they're already deprived, etc. So the workforce isn't going to be as skilled there. So therefore, because there's a higher unemployment, lower income, hence closer to absolute poverty. So it's always relating them last 2 points that it's just whatever causes this decrease in or low income. And the next one is kind of the same thing. So I'm not going to put it as totally a separate point, just a branch off it. So employment in the area. So that kind of goes off the same thing really. As I said, you only need to remember one or two of these things. So Yeah, it's nothing too much hassle. Personally, the ones that I would remember, things that I could talk the most about, is tax. Because when we talk about ways of reducing poverty, tax is quite a good one to talk about, even though it is a cause of poverty as well. Wage rates and maybe regional policy and health. So actually, maybe the 4 or 5 that you could talk about, the most important there. So wage rates, tax, health, age and regional policy. I wouldn't really go into too much detail about lack of information, or maybe even family unit, because they're a bit hard to get your teeth into. Maybe you could say a little bit on the family unit, but you'd be clutching at straws. Really, I would focus on the other, but I just put them in there in case you personally just fancy talking about them. I mean, as I said, I don't think I've given very good explanation of lack of information of family unit. As I said, lack of information really, just people not knowing what jobs are out there. And that's kind of all you could say really, you know. And then go on to the obvious last 2 points of lower income, higher employment, low income, so therefore close to absolute poverty. But really, there's not that much more to say on them two. Okay, so that's pretty much it for causes of poverty. Now, just going to rub these problems of poverty. They're quite simple, really. It's just a burden on the government and low standard of living, which, as I said, branching out into malnutrition and alienation from society. Okay, so what we're going to go on to now is ways of reducing levels of poverty in the UK. Well, not just generally in the UK, actually, so just general kind of ways of reducing poverty. Now, the first one I'm going to talk about is because I almost mentioned it before in the causes of poverty. Now, we talked about tax being a cause of poverty. Now, we're going to look at a way of reducing poverty. So, reducing poverty. So, how can tax reduce poverty? If tax is a sort of a reduction in income? Well, one of the government's main targets is a fair and equal distribution of income. And one of the methods of achieving that, so maybe we're looking at reducing relative poverty here. So we're going to look at a more progressive tax system. So basically this just involves taking from the rich and giving to the poor in terms of, you know, taking higher income tax from the rich and giving the increased benefits to the poor, or whatever the government decides to do. So a more progressive tax system. Now, I love this one in terms of a way of reducing poverty, because this kind of causes quite a few complications with the idea than you might originally think, and it just shows the examiner you've thought a little bit more about it. Now, if we have a more progressive tax system, then obviously the rich are going to get taxed more, okay, and obviously that provides a higher source of income which we can give to the poor. Sort of an anti-relative poverty measure or an anti-poverty measure if you reduce the income tax of the poor. However, one of the first buts that we have to talk about is so if you were, you know, one of the main things that I think about in terms of more progressive tax system is, well, surely if you're taxing the rich that are bringing in more into your economy, that's going to stop people wanting to be as rich. You think, what's the point of me trying to be as richer than everyone else if they're just going to tax me more anyway? What's the point? I mean, all that involves is obviously more work, more stress, to get paid the same as everyone else. I mean, what's the point in that? Why don't you just accept the pay of everyone else and not get taxed as much, and it won't be nowhere near as much effort, I won't have to work as many hours, etc. That's a good point. Okay, so it can if you put the effort on enthusiasm, what's the point of it really? I mean, you know, if I was being stereotypical, I'd say that's a perfect relation to teenagers, but obviously being a teenager, I know that's not the case. Unless you're a scoundrel, then it definitely is. Okay, so that's one of the ways. Now, obviously, as I said, there's a few complications, so there's obviously going to be another one here. So, yes, it can reduce enthusiasm. But can it? That's why I put a question mark there. Because you could say, yes, it does reduce enthusiasm, but if you've got the odd couple of people who are really determined, say, I don't care, I'm going to earn more than you, whatever I do. You can tax me more, I just work harder. So you could use that as an argument. I mean, you know, what's to stop someone saying, I mean, we're just assuming they'll see a higher tax bracket thinking, oh, what's the point? I might as well just earn the same as everyone else and have an easier life. But then they might have worked hard to be rich anyway. You think, okay, well, I've worked this hard, I'm just going to work a little bit harder so I can get my original pay back. I mean, they may see their their income increase, but if they're being taxed more, then their overall income will stay the same. So you have to think of this in terms of, I really think of this in terms of the enthusiasm. Are they going to be enthusiastic because of a more progressive tax system? Well, yeah. Well, no, because obviously they're going to be taxed more. So what's the point in working as hard as they do if they're just going to end up being paid the same as everyone else anyway? But then you could also say, well, yes, that could be the case. But if they want that higher pay, then they're going to be more determined to work for the high pay, which actually could promote more skill, more British skill if you're looking in terms of the UK economy. Then you could say, okay, well, relates to international competitiveness. If they want to work harder, if they want to produce more, yes, they're going to get taxed more. But it's kind of a counter-incentive, really, to what we're originally thinking about. So they become more productive, so they're more skilled, so they help exports. You could link it on and on and on. But as I said, you've got to have some economic theory behind it. But that's why I love that one, because there's so much you can talk about just from a couple of words there. Okay, so we'll just go over that again in case I was going way too fast for you. So we're talking about having a more progressive tax system, which just involves the higher the income. It's just we have income brackets. So if you earn over 40,000, you get taxed X amount. If you earn over 50,000, you get taxed X amount plus one. For example, I've seen that plus £1, but you get the idea. And because that does reduce enthusiasm for people who are working rich, because they think, oh, what's the point? I'm just going to earn the same as everyone else. But I just put a bit more work into it, so I might as well not put that extra bit, because what's the point, right? I mean, I'm just going to get paid the same as everyone else anyway. But then you could also say, well, maybe they want that extra bit, so they're prepared to work that extra bit more than they already are doing. So you could say, oh, well, it actually benefits the economy, making the economy produce more, which could make them more competitive in export markets, for example. Okay. So that's a more progressive tax system. Now, the other one, obviously this is how governments intervene, so I think this is for June 2015, question 2B, sorry. If you are looking at a question where you can relate these points, just go on that paper that I've uploaded, and question 2B is quite a good one. So anyway, so more progressive tax system, so that's the kind of thing I love to talk about. The next one is increasing the skills of the workforce, which you increase the invest in education, in training, and education. Because if you've got a more productive workforce, then it's going to be more attractive for businesses to employ people. Let's say if we look at the government's going to invest in training and education in the UK, then not only is that a bit more beneficial for UK-based firms, but it also encourages a lot of what we call foreign direct investment, which is the financial section of the current account, of the balance of payments, sorry. Okay, so investment in training and education, which means, I think Michael Grove's the education secretary, if I'm right. You might want to look that up anyway. Makes you seem like a little bit more intelligent than me and everyone else in the exam. So if we invest in training and education, obviously means it's more productive, more attractive for businesses to hire someone. Hence, they're going to have a higher income, so they're less likely to be unemployed. Or another way of saying it is it increases their career aspects and income potential. Got to kind of speak anymore. Now, the next one I'm sure will be quite popular with those who, like myself, are sick to death of watching these benefit programs where people rig the system. Now, it's because we have something in the UK called a universal benefit system, where we just give it out. We just set a quota in terms of, if you have, certain aspects of it. If you are earning under £21,000, then you receive X amount of benefits, for example. Now, that is a universal approach because we're not really looking at individual cases. We're just saying, oh, can't be bothered, I ever have 500 quid per week, for example, for, you send back to Romania. That's just the stereotypical approach. Please don't take that on me. Just yet, anyway. Okay, so what I'm saying is we need more of a means-tested approach to benefits. And how will this help poverty? So means tested. benefit system. So how you may be saying, okay, well, that's very good, and that's very attractive, but how does that actually reduce poverty? Well, if there's means tested, then obviously we're going to be giving less to those people who don't deserve it, but more to the people who do. So one of the ways that people on close to poverty, who don't have an income, them don't have a source of income from a job or rent, their main source of income is benefits. So if we are doing a means tested system, we're not necessarily giving out less. We should be giving out less to people who don't deserve it, in terms of people who are rigging the system kind of thing. We're going to be reducing the amount we're giving to them, but the people who might have been looked over before, if there's a means tested, they've been having more attention being paid to them. So people on lower income are closer to the line of poverty, therefore we're going to be paying more out to them. So surely that's a good thing, if we're giving out more to the people who do deserve it. So it means tested benefits, reducing the closeness they are to being in poverty. Okay. The next one kind of goes off this. The next one kind of goes on from this, really. So you could kind of link these two together if you want. That's why I'm going to do it off a branch. And it's another one, like the more progressive tax system, there's a load of complications and it's really good to talk about. It's called increasing benefit entitlement. So it kind of goes off increased benefit entitlement. So before we said, we'll give you X amount if you earn under 21,000. Now, obviously it's means tested as well. Increased benefit entitlement. So if we're giving people more in terms of benefits, what does this actually mean? Well, the reason I don't want to link it off like this is because I don't have the space and I can just kind of talk about it. Alright, so if we're giving people more in terms of their benefits, then obviously they've got more of an income, more to spend. So if they've got more to spend, the likelihood is we're assuming they will put some of it away, but they will spend more. And if they spend more, greater proportion of their income, which was something we'll go into F585, if they spend more of their income, then so if they spend their income to the benefits, the increased benefits they get, they increase aggregate demand. Now, we know from F583, with what we're currently in, we should know that labour is a derived demand. So basically, labour will only be demanded if the thing that labour produces is demanded. So it's kind of like a vicious circle. Now, if we're increasing benefit entitlement, more people are likely to spend because they've got a greater income than they had before. So therefore, they are more likely to demand products, which demand jobs, which create incomes for people who necessarily might not have had that before. However, that's very good. It's all very good. If we increase benefit, then more people got to spend, so more people are going to have jobs created. But whether them people actually apply for them jobs or not is totally up to the alternative view of increasing benefit entitlement. Now, we said it's very good if you increase benefit entitlement because more people have access to greater funds that they wouldn't have had before on benefits. But if we're increasing benefit entitlement, then the other alternative, which is obviously working, we're assuming the pay for that is staying the same. And if the benefit's increasing and the benefit increases past the amount the worker's being paid, then so what's the point in working? I suppose you've got benefits to get paid more for sitting on my ass all day and watching Sky Plus and end up in Jeremy Kyle in a few weeks. So therefore, what I'm trying to say in a kind of humorous way is we could actually end up increasing something we call voluntary unemployment, which is where someone chooses to be unemployed, just to sack it, walks out backwards with two middle fingers up at the boss saying, I'm going on benefits. So therefore you can say, oh well, it increases voluntary unemployment because, if we're increasing benefits, it's more attractive to be on benefits rather than in work. Okay? So you can say, well, maybe it increases voluntary unemployment, but obviously I said maybe, not say it does. Now the reason I said maybe is because we're going to look at another alternative to that as well. Okay, so maybe it does increase voluntary unemployment because maybe it, increases more than the workers being paid, but maybe it doesn't. However, that's not the point I'm going to go on to. The point I'm going to go on to is we're assuming that these people have dropped out of the labour market and they could have returned, but they don't want to because benefits are nice. But maybe they are old biddies. Maybe they can't enter the labour market, long-term disability. So all we're doing is providing jobs for more people. We're not losing out on any jobs that we may have had if we didn't increase benefits. If these people weren't entering the labour market anyway, we're just giving them a bit of extra cash to spend on the economy, we used to say that's a bad thing. Okay? Now, obviously, the overall effect of increased benefits, so if we look at all the advantages and disadvantages we said, it could increase aggregate demand because we're increasing an income for someone who's on benefits, but you could increase unemployment because more people are attracted by, the benefits rather than the working. But then we also said that maybe these people weren't going to apply for a job anyway. Now we need to look at the magnitude of them last 2 points we just mentioned to work out the overall effect on increasing entitlement to reduce poverty. Now, if the people that you're increasing the benefits to are more of them people weren't going to enter the labour market anyway, then surely it's just going to be beneficial because it's just going to increase spending that wouldn't have been there otherwise. But you have to remember this is debt fueled spending because the government's got to be borrowing this from somewhere. But I mean, short term economic growth is brilliant for. Alright? But if a greater percentage of them people dropped out of the labour market because they didn't, benefits were more attractive, then that's going to reduce employment because people are, not wanting to supply the labour. Okay, so really that's essentially what we're talking about here, right? So anyway, that's pretty much everything about increasing benefit entitlement. So I've kind of gone over that a few times, so hopefully you've got that. Please do comment on the video if you don't get the full thing of the main two things. The perfect 2 points to talk about is a more progressive tax system and increasing benefit entitlement. They are two perfect analogies to talk about. No, not analogies, but you get the idea. The next one I'm going to go on to talk about, or the last one, is the trickle-down effect, which I touched on before in this video. So the trickle-down effect. Now, as you can tell, it's something about the spread of income trickling down through the rungs of society. So this kind of thing. It kind of relates to the Lorenz curve where the top 20%, middle 20%, lowest 20%. So if the increase in income affects all of them by the same amount, if the line is at this ideal level, right? So this involves cutting corporation tax and cutting startup costs for businesses. So if basically trickle down effect just says, oh, reduce corporation tax. Now if we reduce corporation tax, surely we should move the long run aggregate supply curve to the right, so increasing our quantity and quality of factors of production, hence long run economic growth. Now, trickle down effect, decreasing corporation tax, that means more businesses are likely to start up, that means more jobs are created, so that should all be good. It should decrease unemployment, therefore increase incomes, therefore reduce absolute and relative poverty. Now, the key thing that is with this is, are the jobs actually available to the people who may have been in poverty anyway? Because if business generally require quite highly skilled labour, they're not going to employ someone who is low productive, has a low productivity level, that kind of thing. So really what we're saying is this is brilliant if the jobs are available to the people who would have been in poverty had the government not reduced corporation tax. Now obviously this has negatives as well, because if the government reduces corporation tax, obviously they're reducing less of an income, so more debt-fueled spending. Okay, so that's pretty much it for this video. So we talked about Gini and Lorenz curve, we talked about absolute relative poverty, causes of poverty, problems of poverty, and ways of reducing it. So I've done quite a lot actually, even though it has been got almost 50 minutes of me waffling on here. But really that's what we're talking about when we mention these kind of things. So the next video is a hell of a lot shorter. We're going to be looking at migration, really. So it's the last little ending to the labour side of F583, which just shows us the possibilities of what's good about having an influx of migrant workers, what's potentially bad, without being too stereotypical, of course. Okay, so thanks for watching this video. Sorry it's been way too long, but I've tried to cover quite a lot, and you can see why it's all related to the Gini and Lorenz curve. We're looking at spread of income and wealth. I didn't want to include it in the income and wealth video because that would have made it well over an hour long, and I'm pretty sure you don't want that. So anyway, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video sometime.